I'm glad that Jamie wrote this book. The Intellivision is a console that I didn't really know much about. The first time I remember hearing about it was on an Angry Video Game Nerd episode, so yeah, I didn't really learn a whole lot about it aside from the basics. It came out at a pretty interesting time. Home consoles were still trying to bring the arcade experience into the living room. Personal computers were just starting to get released, but they weren't exactly, accessible for most people. And you just had a bunch of stuff going on at the same time, and a lot of innovation in video games. So this being released as a competitor to the Atari 2600 was pretty cool. Several of these consoles tried to use the home console as a Trojan horse to get computers into people's living room, sort of releasing them in like a modular format. You would buy the console and then you could get these add-ons that would turn it into a computer. That's pretty much what Mattel was going for with the Intellivision, according to what I read in Jamie's book here. They weren't the only company to do this. Atari went a different route by just releasing personal computers. And I have to say, none of the companies that really released like modular computers like this or modular consoles really succeeded in the long run. You had companies like, I believe it was APF, but I'm not sure on that one. And then you had Coleco do it, and you had Mattel do it. There might be a few more that I'm forgetting, so feel free to fill in the blanks in the comments. Jamie does an excellent job of explaining how Mattel got into video games and why they really left the video game market. There is a lot of information in this book. Some of it is presented through rather rose-tinted glasses, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Jamie has a personal connection with the Intellivision. He played it a lot growing up, and he collected for it. So that's kind of the perspective that he is approaching this from. So he goes into the history of Mattel Electronics. This was the company that Mattel created in order to handle all of their handheld electronic games and also the Intellivision. And it also was their software developer as well. It was working on their, keyboard component for the Intellivision and later the Aquarius, which was a kind of ill-conceived computer, if I read it correctly. While Jamie does talk about the LCD games, they're not really the focus of what's going on here. It really is the Intellivision, which he does an excellent job of explaining just how far ahead of the Atari 2600 it was. He also gets into the marketing of it, so George Plimpton gets talked about, and that's kind of cool as well. I really like how he goes through and he describes a lot of the games that were made for the Intellivision. He kind of talks about how, because Mattel didn't have the rights to a lot of these arcade games, and they weren't an arcade manufacturer, they sort of took ideas from one or two popular arcade games and they would kind of mash them together. They would also have all their sports titles as well, and they were one of the first companies to actually license sports sports leagues, like Major League Baseball or the National Football League and so on and so forth. They also licensed some weird stuff, which I didn't think there was actually like a league for, which was rather interesting to see in here. You make a bowling game, you don't really expect them to license the Professional Bowling League or anything like that, but yeah, just weird stuff like that, where I wouldn't expect there to be a license attached to it, but there was. He does do a good job of explaining that Mattel was able to get third-party support, including from the other console manufacturers. That was something that I don't know why I was surprised to see in here, but it was kind of cool to read about. Also, some other stuff that I was aware of, like the little add-ons that would allow you to play Atari 2600 games on the ColecoVision and also on the Intellivision. It's just wild to think that that happened for a while. It's kind of crazy because you wouldn't necessarily see that today. You would just see a publisher release it on multi-platform. You wouldn't see something where Microsoft would say, okay, if you put your PlayStation disc or whatever weird format Nintendo wants to go with into our system, it'll play with this specific add-on. That's just kind of weird to think about today, and it's really cool that it happened back in the 80s. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but Mattel wanted to initially release a keyboard add-on for the Intellivision, and that gets talked about throughout the book, mostly about how it was delayed over and over again, how Mattel was getting flack from the FTC, and just how they were, getting into trouble for advertising this thing and not delivering it. It's a fascinating story to read about, and I kind of wish it was really its own thing. Like if it could be just plucked out of Jamie's book and someone expand on it a little bit more and just turn it into its own thing. That would be kind of cool to read about at some point, or to get deeper into it. It is brought up how just all these different delays with the keyboard add-on sort of caused it to fall behind the personal computers that were being released around the time. Because it was brought up in, if I'm getting my timeline right, it was brought up in the early 80s, and then it wasn't released until like 1983 through mail order or something like that. I could be off a little bit on the timeline there. It might have happened in 82, but I don't have it written down in my notes. I'm sorry about that. He does get into 1983 because that was kind of an odd year for everyone in the video game industry, but particularly for Mattel. Jamie focuses on the two CESs, which are the Consumer Electronics shows that happened that year, where they announced a redesign of the Intellivision and a few new products as well. And then he goes on to kind of talk about the successor console that was announced at that time, but never released. He brings up the Mattel Aquarius, which was unveiled during the summer CES of 1983, and how it was just like this really underpowered computer that nobody really asked for and even fewer people wanted. I'm not even sure if it was important to the Mattel Intellivision story, but it does speak to just where Mattel was going at the time, and it does kind of talk about how, or it's sort of alluded to that it was part of the downfall of Mattel Electronics, because they pulled R&D off of working on a successor console for the Intellivision, and then kind of put it into this Aquarius, which didn't sell well and nobody really wanted. From reading this, it seems like Mattel had the same problems as the other console manufacturers in the early 80s. They just didn't know how to pivot from their aging hardware to a new one. And this was also before, consumers had kind of been conditioned to abandon the older consoles for the new ones, and that all of their old software was going to be incompatible with the new one. It's kind of weird to see where things were back then and see how they've changed over the years and how just weird stuff has happened. The products that Mattel tried to introduce in 83 just did not end up being as successful as the Intellivision was. And At this time, retailers were kind of losing confidence with just video games in general. So, yeah, that kind of leads us to the impact of the crash and everything like that. So, yeah, let's get into that. I love how Jamie actually explains what happened to Mattel and Mattel Electronics, and also the different versions of the Intellivision company that would spring up over the years. It's a really cool story. Mattel's involvement in all of this pretty much ends in 1984. That's when, Mattel Electronics specifically had lost $300 million, and they had laid off over 1,000 employees over the course of 1983. Their parent company, Mattel, just was done with it and pulled the plug on it. Despite the quality of the games on the console, Mattel sold off the rights to the Intellivision and also just exited the video game market for a while. They would come back later on, but mostly as a publisher/developer, they were out of the home console market. On February the 4th, 1984, Mattel sold everything off to a group of investors led by Terrence Vlasky. He would end up buying the rights to Intellivision from that investor group after a year or so. So in 1985, he buys out all the other investors and changes the company's name to INTV Corporation. Basically Intellivision Corporation, but just written like that. I'm guessing that's what he was going for, but Jamie doesn't really get into it too much, and I haven't seen anything where he kind of explains why he went with that route. I'm sure it's out there, but whatever. INTV would start releasing more games. A lot of them would be just games that had already been promised by Mattel, but were dropped after they left the market. INTV would then finish those games and then sell them at kind of like a cost-reduced, basically cost-reduced. They would have cheaper boxes, stuff would be in black and white, that kind of thing. They would also sell cost-reduced versions of the Intellivision. So the Intellivision 2, which had been made by Mattel Electronics, that would also get sold by INTV as well. They would last until 1990. They tried to pivot to being a publisher for the NES, which I thought was kind of cool. They released one game and then were just kind of done with it. So they left the video game market sometime in 1990. Then in the mid-90s, you get Keith Robinson and the Blue Sky Rangers kind of stepping in to keep Intellivision alive. The Blue Sky Rangers, as it was explained by Jamie in this book, they were just the developers for Intellivision, and they were doing this article on Mattel's Intellivision, and the guy writing the article wanted a name for all of the developers, so they had this brainstorm session, which they called their Blue Sky session, and the guy writing the article heard that and just said, "You're the Blue Sky Rangers now." And the name stuck. So, yeah, that was kind of interesting. It's really cool that that Keith Robinson and this group of people were just kind of a publishing, or not really a publishing arm, but a licensing arm for Intellivision to sort of keep the games going and keep the idea of Intellivision going on in people's minds. There would also be a few flashback consoles that were released, so the Intellivision Flashback. It's also mentioned that there was like a little plug-and-play controller that was released that had a bunch of Intellivision games on it. I've never seen that, but I'm sure it is out there. Just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and Jamie writes about it, so clearly it was out there. Jamie then brings up like the homebrew scene as well as the collecting scene as well. And he sort of talks about how the collector scene for Intellivision and honestly, for Atari and ColecoVision, never really reached the heights of like NES or Super NES or anything like that. So you can still get a lot of these games fairly cheap. I think the problem is just nobody really wants to start collecting for this system, or if they do, they've already got everything. I'm glad that Jamie talks about this part here, but it's really not all that important to the Mattel Intellivision story and also the companies that came afterwards, but it does put a nice bow on it. We're talking about the Intellivision Amico. It gets about a one-page summary of what happened in here, just bringing you up to a certain point, and then, obviously we don't know how it's going to end because it hasn't ended yet. And I think Jamie does a good job of just ignoring a lot of what happened and just saying, okay, it was announced, got delayed a bunch of times, and it's still not out yet. That's pretty much where it is. There's a lot to the Amico story. None of it is relevant to Mattel or the first console war or any of the subsequent companies that came afterwards. And yeah, it should just be off in its own book on its own because, yeah, it's a dumpster fire. And it's just a huge mess of what happened. It's a story of hero worship, hubris, and just a whole lot of lies and bullshit. So I'm glad Jamie didn't get too far into it. The story of Mattel's Intellivision is a really fascinating one. Mattel took some chances and created a pretty unique system. The games were pretty good, but they weren't enough to really overcome the North American video game crash where retailers lost all confidence in video games. That is a subject for an entirely different video and has been covered in other books so far. I think Jamie does an excellent job of telling the story of Mattel's Intellivision. It's an interesting console, and the community that's sprung up around it is very passionate about it. While it isn't as popular or well-known as other retro systems, it is a cool part of video game history. This is an excellent book on the subject, and especially since this isn't covered very much, I haven't seen other books that really cover the Mattel Intellivision. I covered one book about the Amico a while ago, but that was really more of a promotional pamphlet than anything else. So if you are interested in just really about Atari or video games in the early 80s, definitely check this out because it is a really fun book. I'm kind of wondering what Jamie is going to cover next because, I usually learn some pretty cool stuff from his book, and seeing him cover this was really awesome. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.